Well, I'll bet you I'm gonna be a big star. Might win an Oscar, you can't never tell. The movie's gonna make me a big star, 'cause I can play the part so well.
You're watching the C-Spine Show. I'm Dr. Craig Callewart. Please like, follow, and subscribe. 2 weeks ago, I was in California, actually around the San Francisco area. And one of the first things that struck me when I went to rent a car was the price of gasoline. It was well over $6, depending on the brand one selected as well as the octane. You could be upwards of $7, which I just thought was crazy because here in Texas, we're quite a bit less than that, although our fuel prices have gone up quite a bit. And so I started talking to my sister about it, who actually is at the now infamous refinery just out of San Francisco. And she told me about her job there, which she's been there for a decade, but she was also given a pink slip about 6 weeks ago and told by the oil company that runs it that the political climate had become so unfavorable in California that that national company was terminating all their employees outside of San Francisco, and those that wanted to remain with the company would be moved to Houston. So I'm trying to understand with her, how that can be, and why is it the price of gasoline so expensive? So two things came out of that conversation. One is the West Coast is down to about 4 refineries compared to, say, Houston, Beaumont, Port Arthur, into Louisiana. We have at least a dozen refineries in that area. And if you go down to Galveston and just look east, it's refining for about as long as you can see. And fortunately, some of those refineries are putting money into updates, both to make refining more economical and make it more EPA friendly. So I was talking to my sister again about why their company is leaving California. And one of the reasons is they can't do the necessary repairs and updates on the plants because the state EPA regulations are much more stringent than the federal regulations. And to make any change or any kind of repair requires very costly improvements. So if I understood her correctly, the refinery she's at hasn't made a significant improvement in 35 years. So that makes the cost of producing fuel in California particularly expensive. The other issue is the West Coast is down to about, again, 4 refineries. So there just isn't that much volume to make jet fuel and automobile fuel. And so those fuels are having to be imported into the state. But what was probably most interesting to me is that I had assumed that crude oil was brought to the refinery on a contract price. That is a price that would be guaranteed for 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, as we are in many businesses. Although I knew for oil, it would probably be more like 6 months. And she said, no, it really wasn't. That her refinery bought about 75% of their product on the spot market, which means the price that you hear in the news today of crude oil, it was really the price the refinery was paying for it. She said the longest contracts they had were about 3 months in duration. So the whole thing surprised me. Number one, that she was being laid off. Number two, that we only have 4 refineries on the West Coast, big refineries that is, and Number three, that they were buying on the spot market. So they've left the California area, although not all of their colleagues have, but many have. And as the plant is starting to wind down, Washington, D.C. is stepping in and saying, wait, this is a strategic asset. We can't let the state of California close a refinery, particularly when we only have 4 on the whole West Coast, because the political climate from California all the way north is not very good for refining oil. So now the struggle is going on, and her former company is saying we're closing it just because of the costs of doing it. So it will be interesting to see how all this unfolds. In the medical world, we are having a struggle with manufacturing and devices, somewhat similar to oil refinery, in that we now have commercially pure titanium in much greater quantities than we did 10 years ago. So that has been able to drive down the price of the raw product, but the technological innovations are driving the prices up. So in other words, there's a bit of exaggeration, but for a hip replacement, we would have 5 sizes available. And so the surgeon would need to change the bony anatomy to fit one of 5 sizes. And back when I was doing them in my training in the 90s, we would have 2 sizes. So we would have to change the anatomy, either take out more bone or add more cement to make the knee replacement conform. But now there's 5, and actually there are many places that do custom-made implants that are either 3D printed or they are cast and machined and then sent to the hospital in advance of the surgery. So that's an example of a technological improvement, but it has really driven up the cost. So much like the refineries making gasoline and struggling how to do this economically, we are struggling to figure out how to provide the implants for hips, knees, and spinal implants cost effectively. Paradoxically, insurance continues to pay less and less and less for each surgery on each patient in an effort to put some pressure on the healthcare system to lower its costs. And one can argue that some of that's good, but there's also unintended consequences. We can't continue to lose the strategic assets that we have. And one very noteworthy example is the closure of rural hospitals in Texas. It's gotten to be a real mess that a good chunk of Texas is still an hour away from an emergency room. And as those rural closures occur, it'll be like losing a refinery on the West Coast. So just talking about all this sounds kind of dark and discouraging, but it reminds me of a talk I heard when I was in high school, and it was by Stanley Marcus of the store Neiman Marcus. And he talked about the technological problem he was dealing with when he was a kid up in the Northeast. And he remembered hearing that if commerce continued to grow the way it was growing, that Manhattan was going to be up to 8 foot high in horse manure. And the purpose of his talk is to say, when things start to look dark, technology can bring breakthroughs. And so, as it happened in Manhattan, commerce is not conducted by horses anymore. We had gasoline powered vehicles, and therefore need for fewer horses. And therefore the island wasn't sinking under 8 feet of horse manure. Same sort of thing here, as we in the medical world try to do more technically advanced things with fewer dollars. There have been some technological breakthroughs, and particularly in the neck, we are now able to do reconstructions, fusions as they're known commonly, with smaller implants, which allows us to do smaller incisions. And what would normally be a 5 to 7 day hospitalization is now a 3-day hospitalization. So it's less pain for the patient, less time in the hospital, less use of resources. So it's that story that Mr. Marcus told of horse manure in New York City reminds me of the breakthroughs we have in metallurgy, stronger, smaller implants leading to smaller surgeries, quicker recovery, and less expense.
You're watching the C-Spine Show. I'm Dr. Craig Callewart. Please like, follow, and subscribe.
Well, I'll bet you I'm gonna be a big star. Might win an Oscar, you can't never tell. The movie's gonna make me a big star, 'cause I can play the part.